today. This is a real treat for me to be able to meet some of you outside of the classroom setting. You guys and gals I've had in class before. You're already off on a bad foot, calling people guys and gals. But in any case, I want to remind people that whatever you say can and might be used against you because it's being videotaped or audio taped or both. So if you don't want it on YouTube, don't say it now. But I want to start off by just telling you about two things that kind of motivate this question, and then I'm going to pass out a handout. It's just front and back that gives a couple of the talking points that I want to make sure get talked about. And then I hope that the rest of the time will be a lot of back and forth, not only between you and me, but between you and each other. And we may end up filling up this chalkboard or this dry erase board, at least on this side. The other side is felt, so it's nice and smooth. Maybe we'll flip it over so we have a touchy-feely experience when the hours are done. But the target question for today's club that they were gracious enough to ask me to supply kind of comes from a personal experience that I've had. Actually, a friend of mine had. I promise you this is not my own experience, but vicariously I had to think through it just a little bit. And then it also comes from a way that I often bring up the topic of moral relativism in my classes at the very beginning of the semester, and then in my bioethics class I often bring up this at the end of the semester related to how pharmaceutical trials get carried on in various parts of the world that don't have the same legal restrictions that the United States has. So let me start with a sort of personal case that many of us could find ourselves in, and then we'll move to the more kind of difficult, well, perhaps it's not more difficult, perhaps it's the same difficulty, a sort of industrial strength kind of corporate case. So the personal case is I know somebody who spent a year in another country as a Fulbright scholar, and while they were in this country, they went out to lunch with their host family. Their host family took them to a eatery, a place where they were getting some food, and my friend looked around the place, and it seemed to be a little bit of a kind of lower, how should I put this? It wasn't the most expensive place, but it was also, a place in a main business area. And he noticed that the waitresses were acting very friendly towards the customers, even them as a set of customers. He was there with his host family's father, his host family's person who was his same age, his brother, and then the waitresses were sitting at this table, like around this booth, with them. And what happened after a few courses that they consumed was that the waitresses started to say, why don't we go to the back room where there's a hot tub? And the family, the host family, was saying, yes, why don't we all go back to the back room where there's a hot tub? They kind of indicated using sort of eye gestures and other things that, this is something that you, as our guest of honor, would like to go back and take part in. And my friend quickly realized this is probably a setup where part of the service of this restaurant was to perform sexual favors for the customers. Even though those things weren't explicitly on the menu, nevertheless, this was apparently a custom that was being approved of and even endorsed by the host family that he had been there to visit. Now, in this case, you might ask yourself, why even bring morality into it? There's kind of straightforward prudential reasons not to go and participate in this activity. You don't know what kinds of diseases and stuff you might be exposing yourself to. But even if you were to block those considerations, the question often comes up, well, is this something that you were paying for? Is this part of the 15% gratuity that is what customarily gets included on the bills? And if so, is that a form of prostitution, which would be frowned upon very strongly in many parts of the United States? Also, this person who had a relationship with someone who was back in the United States. And so they wondered, would this involve a form of betrayal to them? I mean, he wasn't just going to get up on the phone and say, Hi there, honey, let me tell you what's going on. Would you mind if I X, Y, and Z? So that's one situation that provides one way of filling in the details of this. Well, let me talk about the biomedical ethics case that often also raises a lot of red flags for people. Certain kinds of drug trials are not allowed to be performed in the United States because we have the FDA, and they have very strict rules about the process of enrolling people in trials for different kinds of drugs. It's designed with many ends in mind. One of the goals is to try to protect prospective individuals from signing up for things that are likely to be very harmful to them. Now, because of these strict rules that the FDA puts in place, some companies feel like, you know what, in order to get some trials underway, in order to try to get some progress in solving problems of human health and getting new drugs to market, they try to go to places in the world where it's less strict to enroll people in clinical trials. Okay, so let's say you're working for a very large pharmaceutical company and you have a chance to help them by expanding their market into another part of the world. And to do so, you would be recruiting people to sign up for these drug trials, which would be illegal in the United States. Would that be something that would be appropriate, or would that be something that would be morally wrong? Now, I recognize that there's a lot of different angles into this kind of question. There's a lot of different ways of going about it. But I wanted to talk for just a minute or two about moral relativism, because chances are you've either thought seriously about moral relativism yourself before coming in here today, or if you haven't thought seriously about it yourself, you've at least heard about it, or you've been exposed to it, or perhaps you're anticipating being exposed to it. Here, let me go ahead and pass out my short one-page handout. It's got a quote at the top of it that I'll read from. How many of you have ever heard of Alan Bloom before? Alan Bloom is an intellectual at the University of Chicago, who is a kind of a student of Plato's, not quite as closely as Aristotle was, but he's somebody who really takes seriously ancient Greek philosophy and American higher education. And he wrote a book back in 1987 called The Closing of the American Mind, which made kind of a splash. Even though Bloom himself is very much, I think you would classify him in many ways as a political liberal, the book was a hero among conservatives as well, because of the emphasis that it placed upon trying to come up with answers to moral questions that were not just based upon, well, here's what I think, or here's what my group thinks. Right? It's an attempt to try to scratch beneath the surface of just individual preferences or group preferences to think about whether morality might be something deeper than those. So Bloom's quote that I started off with says, this was like one of the opening quotes in the book. There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that truth is relative. The students, of course, cannot defend their opinion. It is something with which they have been indoctrinated. Okay, now, I put in the top of this little handout that whether or not you agree with Bloom's quote here, whether you think he's overstating the case in one or many respects, I think that the topic of relativism, especially moral relativism, or relativism about what is right, morally speaking, and what is wrong, morally speaking, it's a topic that often comes up in philosophy. It comes up in ethics classes, but it also comes up in other kinds of philosophy classes. And even if it's not in a philosophy class, it often comes up in one form or another in a number of university discussions. So there's different types of moral relativism, I want to suggest. I'll talk about those in a second. Sometimes these types of moral relativism are thought to be required, or at least helpful, for developing certain virtues, like the virtue of tolerance, okay? Or the virtue of respect for other persons, especially respect for other persons who hold different views of life than their own, or people who come from very different cultures than the cultures that you're most familiar with. Okay, so relativism is sometimes introduced just as a kind of philosophical thesis, but it's oftentimes introduced as something that helps people build character, helps people do well at the university, in philosophy or other places. And I want to suggest, in just this short way of starting the discussion, that there's different types of moral relativism that have some problems to them, right? And I want to suggest that they're sometimes even at odds. The moral relativisms themselves are at odds with the reasons given for accepting them in the first place, namely that they help build character or that they help people respect other persons from different cultures. So the short little outline of what I was hoping we might announce through today goes through a brief characterization of what moral relativism is, as I'll be using it. A second part dealing with different types of moral relativism, some of them more cultural, others more individual focused. Third, the sorts of comments from people that indicate that they subscribe to moral relativism. Fourth, some of the reasons why people are attracted to moral relativism. Right? What's so attractive about this? And then some problems. Let's maybe focus on one or two problems for moral relativism. And then some creative ways of responding, or at least keeping the ball rolling. Now, if you've had any philosophy classes, or if you're planning to take any philosophy classes, you'll probably recognize that relativism is used in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's used as a thesis dealing with truth. That's kind of the way that Bloom first introduces it in his quote, so that somehow all truth, right, even mathematical truth, not necessarily moral, like 2 + 2 = 4, or scientific truth, like the Earth is spherical rather than flat, or historical truth, right, like George Washington did such and so at this time. Some people want to say that truth across the board is relative. Other people want to maybe clarify things a little bit more carefully and say that some aspect of our intellectual inquiry is relative to fill in the blank, the conceptual schemes that we bring to the table, maybe the language that we have, maybe the cultural traditions that we have. But moral relativism, as I'm going to be trying to tease out here, often has a particularly interesting place in these different kinds of relativism. And the moral life includes lots of things. Right? It includes virtues like kindness, courage. It includes vices like curmudgeonliness, cowardice. Okay? It includes standards of conduct dealing with obligation, like what is the morally permissible thing to do, what are morally impermissible things to do. Morality also includes ideals of behavior, like even once you've done what your duty is, couldn't you go above and beyond it to do more than duty requires? What is supererogatory, right? What are the ideals that we might strive for, to be all that we can be, even after we kind of satisfy our duties? So you might think that relativism, morally speaking, might be more attractive for some parts of morality than others, like for virtue, or for obligation, or for our moral ideals, or maybe some kind of blending of these. But what I like to focus on is that kind of moral relativism that often comes up when people think about obligation. They think about what's morally right, morally wrong, morally permissible, morally impermissible. So this kind of moral relativism that I put on page 1 is the idea that what really is right and wrong for you is relative to something, such as your culture. Okay? So take this quote, which I think might be a good expression of this kind of moral relativism. It really is wrong for me to smoke marijuana because my culture says it is wrong to smoke marijuana. It really is not wrong for you to smoke marijuana because your culture says it is not wrong to smoke marijuana. Okay? Now, I put a footnote at the bottom of the page. Footnote 2 gives you 2 quick online definitions of moral relativism that I found the last time I had checked. And one of them is from Wikipedia, not always a reliable source, but I wanted to show you that sometimes they get things fairly correct. And then the other one is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, typically a much more reliable online source than Wikipedia, or just about anything else really. But the Wikipedia quote or definition is that in philosophy, moral relativism is the position that moral or ethical propositions do not reflect objective and or universal moral truths, but instead make claims relative to social, cultural, historical, or personal circumstances. Okay, that's a loaded, interesting definition. Okay, the Stanford definition is somewhat close to that. You could quibble over whether it maps on perfectly, but the Stanford definition says, moral relativism says the truth or falsity of moral judgments or their justification is not absolute or universal, but is relative to the traditions, convictions, or practices of groups of persons. Now, back to the body of my short outline, I said what the idea of relativism is, as I'm trying to narrow it. And I also want to clarify one important thing I'm wanting to distinguish it from, which is oftentimes confused with it, or collapsed into it. But I think it will be helpful to try to tease this apart from what I'm trying to focus on. So as I understand it, moral relativism is not the common idea that what you think is right and wrong is, what you think is right and wrong for you is, quote, relative to something such as your culture. Okay, so here's a quotation that would express this other idea, not moral relativism as I'm using it, but this other idea. Let's say I say this. Okay, I happen to think that it's wrong for me to smoke marijuana, but this can be easily explained by the fact that I was brought up in a certain culture that taught me to think so. Okay? So the idea would be, on this kind of descriptive approach, I'm just sort of noting the fact that, look, I believe this, but the reason I believe it is because I was taught in a certain way. I'm giving you kind of a causal story about how I came to believe it. It's not really trying to get at whether there really is something wrong about the activity and trying to justify the wrongness of it by focusing on, well, this is what my culture says, and that's what makes it wrong. Okay? So one of the important questions that I've put on your handout, I believe, in thinking through moral relativism is, what exactly is morality relative to? Okay, the quotes I just gave about possible approaches said culture. Okay? You think through what morality is relative to, the thesis is morality is relative to culture. But there's other approaches you might take. Right? And one of the most common is morality is not relative to my culture, morality is relative to something about me as an individual. Okay? Now, you can have other things besides culture and individual. Okay? I want to recognize that up front. Hopefully we'll be more and talk about it in a second. But what I want to point out is that these two main families of moral relativism are similar in some ways, although they compete with each other. So I give you some examples. Okay, so cultural moral relativism, as I put it, or CMR, is that morality is relative to certain features of an individual's culture. Whereas individual moral relativism, or IMR, is that morality is relative to certain features of an individual herself.